In part 1, we saw some of the reasons why the idea that the Earth wobbles on its axis is totally false. And it's not often you come across an idea that makes so much sense to you, but it requires you to adopt a totally different approach to the way that you look at everything. Now, for me, the electric and plasma universe was one of those moments. But I have to say that what we are about to discuss today is of equal magnitude. Jim Weininger's idea has both simplicity and elegance to explain a multitude of phenomena and to bring a whole new meaning to the Thunderbolt stickman figure. So without further ado, let's explore Jim Weininger's model. As we discussed in part 1, Hohmann did transit timings of Sirius, and he found that it moved at a rate that actually kept it going with precession. Hohmann became interested in this because of the Egyptian work saying that Sirius was used to mark the calendar because it rose with the sun the same time each year. So here is the question: how can a star moving in a straight line across the sky keep in sync with rotation about an axis for long periods? It can't happen. The star would have to circle that same axis. And this was the puzzle that Jim Weininger stumbled across before he got into the electric and plasma universe. Now, Cruttendon and Hohmann were convinced that this was evidence that Sirius was actually circling us. It was a binary. They wanted to make it our binary companion in a gravity-only model. Jim Weininger's first paper to them was about the motion of Sirius, and that it was not across from the same axis as us, but in fact that we too, both of us and Sirius, were orbiting about a common centre which was much further out rather than being across from us. They stuck with a gravity-only binary idea, and he was stumped until he found the electric universe. Now, in a gravity-only model, there simply was no way for these two stars to be orbiting an axis that was much further out. There simply wasn't enough mass to do this. When Weininger started to investigate the electric universe, he discovered that there was an alternative mechanism which would allow the stars to orbit about a common axis without requiring gravity. And his first clue came when he examined the Helix Nebula. When he stumbled onto the mainstream estimates for the spiraling in the double helix nebula, it was the same order of magnitude as our own precession, and he knew that he was onto something. Also, we see that Alpha Centauri appears to be in a neighbouring G-cloud, which is some 4 light-years away, and this is the same order of magnitude as the 6 to 7 light-year separation of the strands in the double helix nebula. Let's examine our local neighbourhood to understand how these structures might all be related. So starting at our local scale, we can see that we sit on the edge of a local cloud. Sirius is below and across the void area from us, and Alpha Centauri seems to sit on the far edge on the other side of the G-cloud. Now, could these dust clouds actually be filament structures of a much larger filament? So if we move out a little further, we see that the Sun sits on one of the 3 filaments which are arcing away from the Scorpius-Centaurus association. Now, the movement of the Sun makes it appear like these filaments are rippling outwards. And these filaments seem to be aligned with the galactic centre, and that's an important point that we will come back to. Now, as we move further out, we start to see some other important structures. In this diagram, the Sun is at the centre, and to the north, slightly off axis, sits the Pleiades. And further out, you will notice a faint blue band that forms an oval which is called the Gould Belt. Now, this is a vast ring of stars which is slowly expanding, but seems to be gravitationally locked together. Now, just slightly to the north of the centre of this oval sits the Pleiades. Within the centre of this sits another really important structure called the Local Chimney. Now this structure is actually off-axis from the galactic plane, and this actually matches the offset of the Gould belt as well. At its narrowest, it is 800 light years across, and it forms an hourglass shape. So how can all of this information help us to understand how this can describe the effects that we see as precession? So what do we know? Let's just recap some of the facts that we know. We know that there is a regular change in the majority of the stars that we see in the night sky, which has a pattern which repeats every 25,000 years or so. We also know that there are stars which do not follow this cycle at all. And then we also know that we seem to be locked on the Pleiades, and it would seem that we are orbiting this, but on a much longer timescale. Jim Weninger saw all of these and realized that the mainstream gravitational model was not able to explain how all of these could be layered on top of each other. And when he came across the plasma electric universe idea, he realized that this may well hold the key to understanding how all of these could be explained in one simple model. So let's examine Jim Weininger's idea in more detail. Now, firstly, it is important to realize that our galaxy is filled with Birkeland currents, which flow from the outer edge inwards towards the center of the galaxy, but they follow the spiral arms. So they move along the spiral axis towards the center. Now these Birkeland currents, when we think of them, we kind of imagine them as these huge, great big tubes. But the reality is that they are far more complex than that. And in fact, when we talk about the main Birkeland current, this structure itself is subdivided into many smaller and smaller branches, a bit like the veins in our body or the roots in a plant, the way that they branch, but together they form a larger structure. Now the idea here is that this is not just charged particles which flow along the Birkeland currents, but that it is the stars and their relative systems which are being dragged along as well. And it is in this motion that we can start to see the solution to the problem of the perceived precession. Now we do not fully understand how these Birkeland currents form or their structure at all levels, but we can find clues in the remnants which are left behind. And it was when Jim stumbled across the image of the double helix nebula that he realized that this could explain the motion that we see in the sky and why some stars do not move. Now our understanding of Birkeland currents has come on a long way since Birkeland first proposed them, and it is now believed that most will cause the particles to move in a spiral pattern along them. And it is also believed that most Birkeland currents will divide into pairs of currents, which will intertwine, forming a double helix. It is also believed that most of these Birkeland currents will have a Bessel function, meaning that they will move up and down like a decaying sine wave. So now imagine that the main Birkeland current feeding our region is actually composed of a multiple series of smaller Birkeland currents. So each one, as you move down, is smaller and smaller and smaller. And each of these is stranded like a double helix. Now if we re-examine our location, we know that our Sun directly orbits Arcturus, and this means that we are therefore part of one of the smaller strands, so 6 to 7 light years across, and we would orbit around this point, so moving in a helix pattern over and over again. So it's not really a circle, but as we orbit around the outer circumference, we are moving forward in a helix pattern or in a spiral pattern. We would orbit around this point over and over while moving along. And our local stars, which are part of the same filament, would move with us, and they would follow the same path, either in front, behind, or to the side of us. And as we encircle the filaments, the stars further away would be seen to precess over and over again. Now, this motion, so moving from one side of the filament to the other, so as we orbit around, one orbit would take about 25,000 years for us to complete. Now, Sirius is on the same filament and therefore would follow our movement, and this is why it will not precess, and it would still rise in the exact same location every year. Now, one of the problems with precession is that the rate of precession has been changing. And obviously that's harder to explain, because obviously in our model we are talking about moving in a spiral pattern. But if we take a moment to realize that if these Birkeland currents follow a sort of an up and down motion in and out of the axis of rotation of the galactic plane, then that means that the helix pattern has to move upwards or downwards. And as it moves upwards, imagine that we're drawing a circle. Well, that would mean that more area has to be covered by each circle. As you move upwards, you're changing the direction of the motion, and therefore this would mean that our perceived idea of the time period might well change as either the rate of the wave that we are following increases or decreasing, either increasing precession or decreasing precession, depending on how quickly we follow this path. Now, at the same time as all of this is happening, we also know that we are orbiting about the Pleiades, and this must therefore be close to the centre of the main Birkeland current, which we follow as an outer strand. So our strand would move outwards, but at the same time that itself would be twisted around the outer edge. Now, these strands will all move in a helical pattern around the centre, but as the distance is much larger for us, it would take us much longer to complete one orbit. Now, Jim calculated that based on our current movement relative to Pleiades, it would take about 26 million years to complete one orbit. So from one point all the way around, and then we'd be at the same point, but obviously we've moved further along the Birkeland current in that process. And this time frame also seems to fit into the mainstream hypothesis for the Nemesis star, which is thought to disrupt the Oort cloud every 26 million years, causing catastrophes on Earth. There is one other element that we need to draw into this. So we've talked about the main Birkeland current, but that doesn't necessarily explain why the local chimney exists, why there is a pinching, and what the Gould belt has to do with all of this. So the Gould belt is a vast belt which is also centered close to the Pleiades, and itself could be described as a torus shape of stars. And this is an animation of, so this is not the Gould belt, but this is a supernova event that I put in quotes supernova event, because obviously it may not be a supernova, but this is an event that caused material to move outwards, and you can see as it moves further outwards, these ring of stars expand. And this is what is believed that the Gould belt is an example of, but on a much, much larger scale. So the Gould belt does not appear to have formed through the shock wave created by a supernova, because these would lack sufficient punch as evidence in the lack of similar structures created by past supernova. Such an explosion would have compressed the interstellar gas within a giant star-forming molecular cloud in all directions from the supernova. Moreover, astronomers have not been able to explain why the resulting structure would be tilted near 20 degrees from the galactic plane and protrude so much out of the galactic disk. While multiple supernovae have been proposed, the lack of a similar structure in nearby spiral arms does not support this scenario. Our galactic Birkeland current would follow a decaying sine wave pattern, and therefore could be angled at this 20 degrees that we see in the local chimney as it moves in and out of the galactic plane as we move further away. So could a Z-pinch have formed a long time ago centered on the Pleiades, which explosively created an expanding ring of stars? Now, this event could have cleared out the local plasma, leaving what we see today as the local chimney, which would be oriented in the same plane as the Gould belt, and the same plane as the Birkeland current that is moving through that local chimney. Notice that Taurus, the constellation, is pronounced in English just like the shape Taurus, and Taurus is the constellation containing the Pleiades. Yet tracing the origin of the word back, you find that the constellation itself was the name for the cluster, and that originally the name of the Pleiades was Tauri. So the name actually goes with that center, but nowadays the Pleiades only happens to appear among the background stars that we call Taurus. Again, in mythology, as well as some esoteric knowledge, the star Alcyone itself is the central sun, about which our sun orbits, and one of the earliest names for the star literally means central one or central sun. Now, for most people who are familiar with the electric universe from the Thunderbolts, are familiar with the squatter man or the stick man, and this image was supposedly visible in the sky due to the violent plasma and electrical interactions of Venus, Mars and Earth. Jim Weninger proposed that what we see as the depiction of the stick man was on a much larger scale. In fact, if you examine the idea of the main Birkeland current being at the Z-pinch and a toroidal plasma expanding from this pinch, you can then imagine that if we are traversing one of these filaments and looking inwards, then the energy released in this event would be huge, causing a large part of the main Birkeland current before and after this pinch to go into glow mode, just like the nebulas that we have seen before when we looked at Birkeland currents. And at the same time, this expanding torus would also be energized, causing it to be in glow mode too. Now, when you zoom into our location, you should be able to see a giant stickman figure, and to the side you will see the two circles, which are the expanding torus. So this would have been visible on a galactic scale, possibly day or night, and as the torus moves further away and the energy levels start to drop, the main plasma would have returned to dark mode. So what are the implications for this idea? Firstly, it elegantly describes the reasons some stars precess and others don't. It explains why we seem to be locked in rotation around the Pleiades, and it also explains why there is a local chimney and why the Gould belt is aligned with it. And at this stage, this is a concept that Jim has come up with based on the ideas from both mainstream and the plasma and electric universe. But it is not finished. There are certainly areas where we need to understand more about the structure of these Birkeland currents. We know very well that there are stars which form on filaments, and we can trace the size of these filaments, but we don't have them on that in-between scale. Now, it would also imply that humanity is far older than our current understanding. It is believed that the Gould belt formed about 30 million years ago. So how did the ancients know about this, and how did they know that we orbit the Pleiades? And on that bombshell, I will leave you to cogitate and digest that. Now, in part 3, we will be talking specifically to Jim. So these are excerpts that I will take from the conversations I had with Jim to build up my understanding of his model so that I could try and convey it in the video form. It will not be the same as polished as this is. It's going to be more raw, but I think it's important for those that are interested to understand from Jim's perspective how he describes the model, and also there is a lot more detail about this model that I simply can't fit into a 20-minute video. So that will be coming out next week, so look out for that as well. That will be the third and the final one. Well, I say final, but in honesty, because Jim's still working on it, it's probably fair to say that we will come back to this in 6 months to a year's time to find out where we are with this model. But as always, be brave, be curious, the truth is waiting for us. Until next time.